So a couple of years ago, I did a couple of videos going over my very first time reading the Lord of the Rings books. And it was a really interesting experience because, I'd seen the movies, but it was me experiencing this world for the very first time. And so one of the cool things I think about the internet and YouTube is that you can connect with people in that way to where you can see people post, their very first reactions, if they're watching Lord of the Rings for the very first time, if they're watching Star Wars, the original trilogy, or other things like that for the very first time. If you've seen those things for the entirety of your life, then it's nothing new to you, but it's really interesting to me to be able to witness people's reactions to these things for their very first time. And so I wanted to do that for X-Men. And I'm going to put a timestamp for when I actually start talking about the comics in the video so that you can skip to that if you just want to get to that. But I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience with X-Men and with Marvel and kind of where I am with everything. So X-Men are actually the only comics that I've ever actually read beforehand. I remember reading a lot of them when I was in fourth grade, specifically. I don't remember which ones exactly. One of the ones that I'll be talking about today is actually one that I do remember reading. I couldn't give you like an exact like issue number of the ones that I read. And ever since then, my relationship with the X-Men has kind of been complicated because I feel like whenever it comes to media, I feel like the movies are typically people's, first experience with things. That's the media that's typically held at the highest pedestal. And so my experience with X-Men has been complicated because I'm not really a big fan of the X-Men movies. I really like X-Men Days of Future Past, the movie. I really like First Class. I think X-Men 2 is great. But as far as the movies go, I think those are the only really great X-Men movies that there are. And so where my love for the X-Men started was actually in other forms of media. So like I said, I do remember reading the comics when I was younger, a lot of the older comics. I had a lot of toys, some toys that I was into a lot when I was younger that a lot of people don't know. I feel like they're not as well known, at least as this other toy is Mini-Mates. And the very first pair of Mini-Mates that I ever remember getting were Cyclops and Wolverine. And so Mini-Mates were a huge deal. Those were a huge part of my childhood. I feel like I learned a lot about X-Men through Mini-Mates. But also through the video games as well. I remember playing both of the X-Men Legends games. Those games were huge in my house. I absolutely adore those games. Ultimate Alliance, those games as well that came after. And so it's through the games and the toys that I really was able to get a feel for X-Men. There also was another game called Marvel Nemesis Rise of the Imperfects, and there were some X-Men in that as well. I think it maybe just might be Wolverine, maybe Iceman, I'm not sure. But it was through those forms that I was really able to get into X-Men. And so ever since then, X-Men have been my favorite of anything whenever it comes to Marvel. I think that the themes of the X-Men are great. Themes of family and friendship, but there's also death too when it comes to, the political side of things and how it sometimes relates to the real world. And so I've always really appreciated those things about the X-Men. One time in my fourth grade class, I actually got in trouble because I called someone a Homo sapien. Like I said, I was reading X-Men comics a lot around that time, and so I was just calling him a normal person. I was saying that he wasn't a mutant, but he thought I was saying something else, and so I remember vividly getting in trouble in my fourth grade class. So like I said, X-Men have always been my favorite. And so now we'll get into the comics, the ones that I read. So I'll talk about the comic briefly about what it's about, and then I'll talk about how I felt about it. And just as a preface, Cyclops has always been my favorite X-Men character. He's always been my favorite Marvel character. So I just want to preface this with that. I'll probably do a video on Cyclops later on. Jubilee is also probably my second favorite X-Men. I've read a lot of her stuff, so I'll do probably a separate video for her. But what I've read so far of Cyclops is I have read X-Men Origins Cyclops, and this is what it says. This is his origin. And this one was great. I already knew his origin through a video online, actually, but it was cool to see the physical comic of it. It's cool to see his relationship with Xavier and just to kind of see his relationship with Havoc, his younger brother. So I enjoyed getting to see that. And I also read Cyclops #1. This is the 2026 version. The way I'm reading these is through Marvel Unlimited. That's actually how I got into these. And so they didn't have any other versions of Cyclops from this year on that, so I'm going to try and find those ones in person to read them. I do believe in physical media. I actually collect vinyl, and I have a physical camera like I do film photography. So I do believe in having physical media. So there are comics that I'm going to buy. There are comics that I've already bought. I just want to read a decent amount of them through Marvel Unlimited. If it's one that I really like, then I'll buy it. What I read of Cyclops #1, though, I actually liked a lot, so I do want to read more of this. I do believe the run is still going at this time, the time of filming this, so I am looking forward to reading more of that. And I'll just get into the biggest one that I read, the one that I do remember reading when I was younger, and that is Giant Size X-Men. Giant Size X-Men, the best way I can describe this one is that it's essentially like a greatest hits album. It's like, Thriller, or it's like Led Zeppelin 4. How I've been reading comics is basically I've been going by things that I want to read or by characters that I really like that I want to learn more about. So I got into Giant Size X-Men was I wanted to find out the very first appearance of Nightcrawler. And I feel like I struck gold with this one because this is like the first appearance of like what I feel like are some of like the most popular X-Men ever. So this is the first appearance of Nightcrawler. This is the first appearance of Storm. I do actually remember reading this one when I was younger because I always thought when I was a kid, I always thought that Storm was really hot.
Hey yo, what the fuck?
And nothing has really changed with that. But it's the first appearance of Colossus, the first appearance of Thunderbird, it's the first appearance of Banshee, first appearance of Wolverine. And I thought Wolverine actually came in a lot earlier. I know that he appeared as a villain to Hulk, but I thought he came in earlier. I thought a lot of these characters actually came in earlier. And so with Giant Size X-Men, what has happened is all of the original X-Men plus one, they've been taken by this mutant. They're looking for a mutant, and the mutant is the island. And so the island is named Krakoa, and so Krakoa takes all of them. Cyclops is allowed to go back to find more mutants, and so he finds them, and then he brings them to the island to save the rest of the mutants. And so this one is really great. I think that this one is a really great starting off place. One thing I have noticed with these older comics is that they are, I don't want to say hard to read, but they do pack a lot of information into each page. And so what I've been told is that that's what they had to do, I guess, to save money. One thing that I have noticed is that newer comics are a lot easier to read because they're not packing so much information onto each different page. I also forgot Sunfire, and I feel like I forgot Sunfire for a good reason. I think all of these mutants that were introduced, I think they're great. I think Sunfire sucks though. I actually knew about Sunfire before this because of X-Men Legends 2. He's one of the playable characters. But I think he sucks. I don't like Sunfire, and he's the only X-Men character so far that I don't really like. So they go to him and they ask him to come back, and he goes. And then right when they're about to leave, he's like, "Oh, I'm not going." And then like, "Okay." So they're about to leave, and he's like, "Oh, I'm going." And then he's like being mean to Nightcrawler, and it's like, who do you think you are? Not a good first appearance of Sunfire. I actually do not like Sunfire at all. But there's better fire characters in Marvel and X-Men anyways. So Giant Size X-Men I think is really great. I think that's a great starting off place. And I'll talk briefly about the Jubilee ones that I've read. I do want to do a full in-depth video on more Jubilee ones. Like I said, she's one of my all-time favorites. So I read the Jubilee 1999 one. This is where she goes to avenge the death of her parents. And I thought that this one was really great. This one showed a lot of depth to Jubilee, and she goes through this whole arc of really wanting to find them, but she doesn't have like that normal hero moment where she wants to just kill them. She takes her parents' killers in for justice, and I thought that was great. It already shows depth. I also read Jubilee 2004 to 2005, Fresh Princess of Bel Air. This is one of my all-time favorite comics that I've read. There's not a lot of action in this one. It's really kind of down to earth, and it's really more so about the character. I think her aunt is a great character. I hope to see more of her. I think her aunt's butler is a great character too. There's a mystery going on, and I won't spoil it if you haven't read it, but I think their whole thing is great. Jubilee, I kind of can't I can't overstate, I think, how exciting and how great of a character Jubilee is. I think she's so interesting. I think her origin is so interesting. I think her powers are so interesting. Like I said, there's not a lot of action in this one, so it's kind of more so about the characters. There is some action towards the end. When it is there, it is great. And so this one, if I ever find this one in person, I absolutely will buy it. I think that this one is amazing. And then we have first appearance of Juggernaut. So this is Uncanny X-Men 12 and 13. So Juggernaut is also one of my favorite villains as well. He's one of my favorite X-Men. I know about him from X-Men Legends 2 and just other things. And I think this one is great because this one goes into his origin as well as Professor X's origin. They're stepbrothers. Juggernaut gets his powers from the gem of Cyttorak. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. You learn a little bit about Professor X and his whole origin. I think that was really great too. I think it's so cool how essentially Juggernaut can't really be stopped. I feel like at this point in Marvel, I think this comic is early 60s, maybe 61 or 62. I feel like at this point he had to have been one of the strongest characters in all of Marvel. I know that Hulk was around at this time, but I think it's so interesting with how they tried to throw basically everything that they can at him, and it just does not work. They try grenades, they try ice, they try everything, and it doesn't work. And one thing I absolutely adore about this comic is that one thing I adore about all of these Marvel comics is how well they interweave with each other and how well you can still see that there's this living world beyond what you're reading. So I love that it shows Daredevil in the middle of a trial. I think that's really cool. I love how it goes to the Human Torch. These are the early X-Men, so they're not as powerful, they're not as refined as they do become to be in the later ones. But I love that they're throwing everything that they can at Juggernaut. It still does not work. And within this universe, I love that Professor X even calls the Human Torch over. I like the Human Torch a lot, and so I like that it's basically with heat and with with going very fast that they're able to finally get his helmet off, and then that's how they beat him. But it really takes a lot for them to beat Juggernaut, and I think that this is a great introduction to Juggernaut. After that, we get into the introduction of the X-Men. So this is Uncanny X-Men. I've read the very first few of these. I believe I've read until they introduced Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch. I think they betray Magneto. I think that's as far as I've gotten with like the very first ones. And then finally, this is the last bit of X-Men that I'll talk about in this one. I will do more videos on X-Men and other things. I do want to do videos for each of the big events. So like I have read the very first Secret Wars. I do have a video on that, so I will be doing a video on that later on. I want to do a video on Days of Future Past. I actually bought this one physically, the physical copy, so I do want to read through that. But this last one, this is the Dark Phoenix saga. I feel like I struck gold when I walked into this one because I didn't actually look for this one outright. I looked for the very first appearance of Kitty Pryde, and that leads right into that. And so this is Uncanny X-Men. This is Uncanny X-Men 129 through 138. And so there's so much that happens in this one. So I feel like I really struck gold when I found this, and I wasn't even, looking for it. So in this, so from Uncanny X-Men 129 to 138, this is the introduction of Kitty Pryde. This is the introduction of Dazzler. The Hellfire Club is in this. Polaris is in this, and then this is also the Dark Phoenix saga. So the Dark Phoenix birth to the Dark Phoenix death. And so I'll kind of just go through this in order as much as I can. So Kitty Pryde is one of my favorite X-Men, and why I wanted to look her up is because I know that she is instrumental when it comes to Days of Future Past. So I felt like I had to know a lot about her before I got into that. And so her introduction is cool. So the X-Men go to find her, and then when they find her, the Hellfire Club are tracking them. So some of the X-Men actually get taken, and Kitty Pryde goes with them. And so she sends out a message to Nightcrawler, Cyclops, and Jean Grey, who are in New York, trying to find the Dazzler to go and find them, to go and rescue them. And so the introduction of the Dazzler is really cool too. I like her powers. I like getting to see her for a little bit. She kind of like pieces out like really soon. Like they find her and they're kind of like, yeah, do you want to join us? And she's like, no, I'm good. And so she just keeps going. I liked her. I feel like if they are ever going to introduce her in live action, I've seen some people say Taylor Swift, but I feel like Sabrina Carpenter would be an amazing Dazzler. She has acting experience already too. And then we get the Dark Phoenix birth. And so Dark Phoenix, I kind of been put off. There's been two really bad movies regarding it. The 2005 X-Men Last Stand, I think that's not a great movie. Then there's the one that they tried with the new cast, I think in 2019. And that movie I didn't even finish. So Dark Phoenix I've never really cared about just because there's always been some kind of it's just never worked out. Everything that I've seen of Dark Phoenix has just kind of sucked. And it turns into a real tragedy because I think that this is the best thing of X-Men that I've read so far, maybe besides the Jubilee stuff. But this Dark Phoenix stuff, it's so interesting to me and it's so tragic. There's just kind of this thing that just keeps rising in Jean Grey, and so she's just there's just a lot of uncertainty with it. And so the Dark Phoenix, every now and then it'll just come out. She goes to visit her family, and it comes out, she's with the X-Men traveling, leaving New York, and then it comes out too, the whole ship is destroyed. So I think it was interesting how she went to space, and it's Dark Phoenix that's taking over this, but she kind of absorbs a star, and then she ends up killing 5 billion people in the process. And there's this really interesting dilemma that comes up because it's not Jean Grey that did this, it's the Dark Phoenix. And so I did like that there was this council of people from outer space that, essentially like we have to kind of get rid of her. And there's this really interesting with her and the X-Men to where, they believe that Dark Phoenix needs to be destroyed because of her crimes. And you get it from their point of view because, that's 5 billion people that have been killed, just like that. And so you get it from their point of view, but then you also get it from the X-Men point of view where they're like, she's, our friend. This is what I mean when I say that I love the X-Men and the found family aspect because, there is this great bond that's been established with her and the X-Men, and especially with her and Scott. I saw some screenshots that I took when I was reading it, and it really, just drives home the great love that there is between Cyclops and Jean Grey. And I really love this, and I feel like this comic, really drives home, just how great this relationship with him is and how much of a tragedy is that, within Jean Grey there is always the Dark Phoenix. But I appreciate that the X-Men are given a chance to fight. Charles calls out like some like old standing tradition where they challenge, to fight. And I appreciate that the X-Men, as much as they could, they were there to fight for Jean Grey. They were there to save her as much as they could, and at the end of the day, they just couldn't do it. And Jean Grey kind of sacrifices herself, and it's really sad because they tried everything. Getting to read it is something that was amazing. Whenever I get the chance, I will buy a book of this Phoenix Saga because I thought it was great. It's one thing that I kind of can't wait to read again. So Phoenix Saga was great. And as far as X Men comics go, these are really the first ones that I read. I've enjoyed all of them. I don't think there's a bad one in any of the ones that I've read, and so the X Men are something that I'm really looking forward to getting to know more. Yeah, there's just so much. And the X Men have always, like I said, they've always been my favorite team. They're always something that I've always felt, really passionately about. And so, if you have any X Men comics, if you have any ideas of good things to read, things that aren't super, well known, please feel free to comment them down below. I'd love to read them. I will be reading more Jubilee as much as I can. I will be reading more Cyclops if you want to get into more Nightcrawler and different things like that. So that's pretty much it as far as it comes down to the X Men. I wish that I read comics earlier. I've had an absolute blast reading through these X Men ones so far. I'm gonna read a bunch more. And if you've made it this far, thank you so much for tuning in. Please feel free to like, comment, subscribe. I will be doing a lot more videos on these and different comics as well too. And if you like what you've seen here, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one.